Opening slide graphic text. Focus on the good things of life. Title: Needs. Image of John Armstrong. Logos, Belonging Matters, and TalksThatMatter.net.
And so earlier we discussed what is a need anyway, and you picked up on the idea that it affects our desires, and that a person yearns to have a need gratified. Now, this can be tricky for some of us when our needs have been satisfied. And if we've lived a life where, our needs are largely met, we may not have experienced too much in the way of this yearning. But if you do have an area of your life that isn't met, it's interesting how it can start to preoccupy your thinking, especially in relationship contexts, where you think there's something here that's missing, and it starts, in a sense, to grate on you, and you think about it and you can dwell on it. So there's that subjective aspect where someone else, the same set of circumstances could exist, but it doesn't worry them at all. And so it's not a need they're particularly put great weight upon and or emphasized. And interesting aspect. Another one is that if depriving the person of what would meet that need has a number of impacts to it. And the first is it may sicken the person within. So you see they're obviously not able to function fully. They're not operating at their best, and almost like a state of limitation upon things that they will bodily need. So there are aspects of needs that are physiological, but there are also aspects of needs then that are supra-physiological. They sit above, you might say, the straight bodily things. And that's where Lauren's comment about love came in, is that my need for love is supra. But if I didn't have love for a long time, maybe had never experienced that and belonging and being wanted, then you can see that it might, in fact, begin to have a physiological effect upon the person. And then it obviously then stunts the person's growth and development. They can't move forward and are held back by this. And of course, when in the past, only a few decades ago, where so many people lived in institutional contexts, we actually saw people like this who had not progressed because there was such a limitation. You might say their needs were sacrificed for the service model that they were within, and it stunted their growth and development quite unnecessarily. So people were made disabled in that sense. It added to their situation because of the way that they were being treated. And then, so we see then the gratification of the need, though, has this therapeutic response to it. It remediates the yearning and deficiency, and that inhibited growth is now removed. And in a sense, and we might say it releases now the person towards their development and their growth and their well-being. So here's a bit of an example that I've used. It's a bit old now, but of course we still have people in this situation. And this, at the time, this man was the longest serving detainee in immigration detention. And he makes some very interesting comments through it, because he says that they had no idea of what their future would be. They couldn't anticipate that future, and they had no control over it. So they are two sources of a great deal of stress, that being out of control and uncertainty, and they had bucket loads of both. And so it was interesting, he comments that people didn't even have the energy to talk with each other. So people kept to themselves because interaction itself became too hard given the load that they were under. So that's fascinating. And so he talks about the delay took a toll on his health. He tried to keep himself sane in Villawood, like good luck with that, but by reading and playing chess and billiards, everyone there is suffering because they are not certain of what their situation is. He said, they're all trying to be alone. Isn't that fascinating? Most of the time I wanted to be by myself too. I just stayed in my room. And then notice this, he says, the simple things like walking his children to school or visiting local shops are extremely wonderful. And so he walked out of the detention center. They unlocked the door. He walked into the arms of his wife, Karima, and their 3 children. I think he'd been in there for about 7 years. And so fascinating. So in some ways, it's not necessarily very difficult to meet certain needs. Walking into the arms of your wife and seeing your 3 kids and going to the shops will do a lot of good things, isn't it? So that's a fascinating example, but also his insight into the impact that it had on him psychologically and bodily. And so as we carry on, that a steady supply of whatever meets the needs forestalls sickness and failure to thrive. So that's interesting too, is that in one sense, our needs have to be met in an ongoing sense. And it's not like you can just say, well, I told you I loved you 20 years ago. Wasn't that enough? No, you need a bit of a constant supply of that reinforcement and reassurance about those things. And then, of course, adaptive, healthy people do not have deficiencies in this area. They're going to be thriving. And so you realize that when people are devalued and then they begin to experience many of the wounds of those devaluations, that truncates their ability to have so many of their needs met, and this failure to thrive. And so one of the impacts, you might say, of all that wounding is that an incredible load that people carry. And when we're well off, we often don't appreciate, like a homeless person having to work out where they will sleep tonight and where they will eat, the most basic things, and they have no idea. We don't have to worry about that. We've got food in the fridge and in the cupboard. We probably even might have food that's already prepared, and we just have to eat it, heat it up, and we don't have to think about that. And yet, for many devalued people, that now becomes a load, an additional load. And so you say, why doesn't this person just get through life more efficiently? Well, because they're carrying a load. And but we can also fail to see that and recognize that. So here's a bit of an exercise for you. Can you create, given that I'm assuming here, and I might not be right in my assumption, but that for many of you here, many of your needs are met, and therefore becomes sometimes a bit harder to know what your needs are. You tend to recognize them far more readily when they're not met. Man, they are front and center in my thinking. But when they're largely met, I don't think about them nearly so much. So I wonder if you would write a quick list of what needs you have that are largely met. Now that's an interesting thing. And then we want you to ask, how are they met broadly? How do you meet them? And we'll come back to you, give you a couple of minutes for that. And we'll see what you've got to say.
Hi, John and everyone. The second question, how are they met broadly? I'm not sure I understand that. Isn't it sort of similar to the first one?
Yeah.
For example, shelter, how is it met? I have a house. Is that?
Yes, but a bit more broadly, you might say you meet some of your needs yourself. Other people meet your needs. And there's a third category, if you can think of this. So it's really just 3 things. You meet a lot of needs yourself. You live with other people who meet your needs. And there's a little third category. So that's what I meant by the broadly, is sort of stepping back from the specifics of how you do that more to a couple of big categories of how you go about that.
Oh, thank you.
So I might have given it away a little bit, but let's, rather than delve into your personal needs, we'll leave that list there. But what did people have to say about how they were met? What have you got about that? Who'd like to come back in and give us your thoughts about that?
Oh, I just had family, friends, community. I hadn't thought about myself.
Yes, yeah, isn't that interesting too? Yeah, and but it's a lovely thing to have such an orientation to the other people in your life, and most of those are informal too, aren't they? That there are people that we relate to that do so without us who do that in a freely given way. And it is quite informal. You might make certain arrangements in advance, but it's not like there's a third party that are inspecting you. My wife and I go walking with a neighbor 3 times a week. And it's just a little arrangement we have, and we go chatting and walking around the place, and it's for exercise and a bit of sunshine, hopefully. And but it's not like we have to then, when we return home, write case notes about that. It's informal, and yeah, it's a very,
Or sign
very
yourself back in.
Or sign myself back in, or wear my lanyard while and check out anyone else I speak to. Have they had a police check in advance? It's just, you know, it's informal, and it's just a beautiful way of having our needs met. We love it. And so anyone come up with a third way, anything in addition of you meet your own
formal supports or services, I suppose.
Right. That's right. Exactly right.
Yeah.
Formal supports and services. So we pay some people, whether it's the doctor, the guy who fixes a roof, you know, your masseur, chiropractor, we have arrangements that we pay for. So that's an interesting bundle of ways then to think about that a lot of our needs we have capacity to respond to ourselves, and that's part and parcel of our competencies. Then we relate to a lot of other people and we exchange needs. It's reciprocal. And then we meet them in formal, official, sometimes contractual ways. You get in a new kitchen, you might have to sign a contract for that, you know, and that you're expected to pay at certain amounts at certain times. And if you don't, there's trouble, you know, those sorts of legal, financial arrangements. So there are 3 things. Now you think about this for people who have an intellectual disability, and these 3 things begin to change. Perhaps the capacity to for a person to meet their own needs, to be responsive to that and know what to do, may be limited in certain specific ways. Then there might be a shortfall in the relationships and friendships that they have with other people who might be in freely given relationships or love them may also be limited. And therefore we see this reliance upon paid arrangements to be responsive to needs. And yet many of the needs are met in freely given ways. How can I pay someone to be my friend? It's like a contradiction, you know, and they're going to come and go like a little army, another person, and like serial abandonment. So that creates a real problem, doesn't it? Of the reliance on formal paid arrangements to meet the needs that would normally be met in informal ways. So now it's not wrong to use the paid arrangements, but I guess we're signaling if there's almost a total or complete use of paid arrangements to meet my needs, then there's going to be a shortfall, at least in some needs that should have been met in other ways that paid people just can't do. So one topic we might cover in the future, this might be something for Carmen to take note of and to remind me, is a whole set of material we've developed on the intrinsic limitations to paid roles. And that'll make a really nice session. It's a really good session, that one. So
John, Charles Eisenstein's been writing about this, how in general our culture is moving to, you know, the sorts of things that were largely unpaid in the past, like childcare and babysitting and you know, dog walking. I mean, he gives so even music, you know, was a community affair, and food, like even restaurants, you know, this whole idea of it was very unusual to eat out. Even, I don't know, 40 years ago, it was, you know, it wasn't something you did. It wasn't an everyday thing. People shared food. So yeah, I imagine that in the area of yeah, people that have special needs, that are disabled, you know, it's become even more prevalent.
that's right. Yeah, and that's an interesting thing, given that we've shifted from the institutional model, the total institution, and such a paid arrangement, but into a communal life, but where the communal life itself has slipped somewhat in certain areas. Although I think Castlemaine might have a bit of an advantage on, some other areas of. I go up there occasionally for their Sunday market, which is a beauty, and but everything has been commercialized, and there are some good reasons for that, of what Wolf called the post-primary production economy, where lots of things we used to do freely because we were getting money for other things, but a lot of that's disappeared. And so service has become the major growth area. And therefore this giving that we used to adopt in our life and in a freely given way is now becoming commercial enterprise and house cleaning and things like that. And fair enough, we're not criticizing that, but it is a shift. And where we almost expect everything to be paid. And we pay a price for that. That comes at certain prices. And yeah, that's a nice comment. And that may also send some signals about how hard it is to support people into communal contexts where payment is an expectation of the interaction. But hopefully there's still some voluntary associations and people who relate together in a freely given way to some extent. But you're quite right. Even exercising now, you've got to do boot camp and pay a fee to be in the park to exercise with a coach and so on. And our final question, of course, is what would happen to us if our needs weren't met? If we had needs, and probably realize that we'd much more focused on those needs, and it might hold us back and, of course, prevent us from moving forward in certain ways. And then that becomes like we feel burdened by the unmet need in some way. So now, when it comes to the people we support, one of the ways then we need to be careful of is how do we assess the needs of someone that we might arrange something that's relevant and potent for them. And part of that is then assessing the experiences that people have had that have shaped their life, where have they come from, and who is this person. And that's like a prolonged conversation about, what has happened to bring this person to this point. And so experiences can shape us in certain ways. And now that experience also includes the experience of having a disability, an impairment in some way, vision or hearing or physical disability and intellectual disability. What is the impact of that? And we have a whole separate one-day workshop on the impact of intellectual disability. And so we're not just wanting to know the experiences, but how have these experiences impacted this person? What impact does that impairment have? And what impact does it have, perhaps not to have ever experienced a freely given relationship? We sometimes think that paid relationships are their friends and things like this. So you can, quite often, what we're dealing with is the impact of the past, not just the past. And so we need a way of translating that into an impact. And so then we think, so what is it the person needs? And we can get to people's needs by flipping the impact. So if the impact is I've never had a chance to grow or learn, then clearly I need a chance to grow and learn. The need is not so difficult to come up with because it's simply the reverse of how this person's life has been impacted so far. And so we've taken it through several steps here. And so we might end up then with a series of needs, having examined the impact of the person's experiences. But then there's an interesting question about, but of all the needs the person has, which one is most urgent? Which is the most pressing need that we now need to respond to? What is that? And there may be something that needs to be addressed straight away, because if we don't, and if we try and pursue something else, the urgent need tends to blow up in our face. So that's an interesting aspect, isn't it? So if you needed to go to the toilet urgently at the moment, but I had that break, but I missed it, and I need to go to the toilet, and you're probably not taking in what we're talking about. But once you've been to the bathroom and then come back, now you're ready. And urgent needs work that way as well. they often need to be addressed. And so when in passing, we're assessing a service's response to someone, we're asking, in a sense, are they receiving what's most relevant, which means, are they getting a response to the most urgent need? Of course, services tend to want to do things that they like recreation, or because the staff are interested in something, and therefore people are sluiced into those kind of topics and programs because of staff preference, rather than knowing what the urgent need is. And that's where we can get then life wasting, that is doing things that people don't need, to the extent that their time has been wasted, which is their life, of course. But in doing the urgent need, we're still keeping a mind on something that's long-term, like people might need to be treated as an adult. Well, that's maybe for some people a long-term pursuit. But at the moment, they might need to look their age, which is a much more urgent need perhaps for someone. And that comes from their experiences and how those experiences have impacted their life. So that's a little set. So we don't have time today to ask you to think about someone you know and support, where you can do step by step and then put you in a group and you share that and get some practice at this. And in a sense, it's trying to highlight, our thinking. Help me to think through some steps here that more increases the chances that I can think about someone's needs more accurately and have a less subjective calculation. One of the things you can consider too is that when a person is impacted by a past experience, what is the impact of the impact? So let's, for instance, say an experience is that I've never had many experiences in the open community, or I've never had a friend. And you might say, what's the impact of that? Oh, well, I don't make friends easily. What's the impact of that? I don't try and meet other people. What's the impact of that? I have no one in my life. What's the impact of that? I have no models that I can imitate. What's the impact of that? So then you get down into some pretty deep areas here, and you realize sometimes that some of the things a person's struggling with right in front of you is the impact of the impact of the impact of the impact. So that's a really, really interesting little exercise. And it's an exercise we do when you do your passing workshop. We visit a group of people in a service and we get to know them and we discuss this. Because the team has to write, but what is it people need? We can't assess the value of the service unless we realize what people need, and we've had a look at what they get. Do they match? Does that make any sense? And if it doesn't match, what's the impact of that and on people? So here are some. Now this is a bit like Maslow. Now Maslow was an expert in motivation. So he was thinking, if someone needed that yearning we talked about, what would be the first thing they yearned for? Might be one way. And of course, so here's the physiological needs, the bodily integrity, the sense of personal security is a big one, right? The age-appropriate competency promoting social roles. I have to know who I am is a big one, even from the youngest age. And then, of course, I get to exercise and learn to control myself. As a baby, I had to learn to eat, I had to learn to toilet, and I had to learn to sleep. And you notice when kids haven't got those three behaviors down pretty well, that there are problems, if they're still 5 and aren't yet toilet trained, so they haven't learned to eat a range of food, won't go to bed and sleep, so there are problems. And it's the beginning, you might say, of learning to exercise control of myself, that self-mastery. And then we need the enrichment of experiences. So engagement, risk-taking, initiative, and then all sorts of developmental potential, like our self-help skills, our intellectual ability. There's skills and habits, communication, interaction, capacity to reside independently. And here's one we often overlook, the ability to use free time adaptively for self-renewal, like doing some of that gardening that Samantha does. And so it's that sense that even when I have free time, I'm going to use it well, something that many devalued people are not shown. And then, of course, economic security and independence, protection from property diminishment and impoverishment. So that's an area of need. And then, who am I? The expression of self and my uniqueness. And so you see that parallels pretty well a lot in Maslow's hierarchy, and helps us examine sometimes when we're thinking about people's needs, have we missed any areas? But it doesn't necessarily assume that like number 8 is the most important. For some people, it's the problem of keeping them alive, right? Life maintenance is so important. They might be having seizures so continuously that that's the level we're working at. We're trying to keep this person out of seizures long enough because it's having a detrimental effect on them in so many ways. And that's the level we're working at. And so let's finish then with a couple of thoughts about how often we get this wrong and why is that. And especially the more formal our efforts are and the larger our efforts to a larger group of people, it seems to be easier to mess this up the bigger organizations become. And that makes sense. And we all look forward to this when we're using our aged care service and living in some facility. We're going to think of this overhead. And the first in an unwillingness, perhaps, or an inability to identify with the people being served. And we fail to step into their shoes and identify with what they're experiencing. Well, that'll do it. That'll leave us really distant. And it's interesting that this is often taught as the way all professionals should operate, is to not identify with the people you're serving. To do so is to be unprofessional. So we even have some of this stuff built into the way people are prepared for service. And a service might be meeting the needs of other actors. Now, they probably all do. The issue is, though, meeting the needs of other people, families, the board, the hierarchy, even the funders, but at the expense of the person being served. Now we have a moral problem, don't we? And then, of course, training can disorient and distort and socializes to seeing people's needs in a narrow, peculiar way and ignoring everything else. A mother with an intellectual disability may need help supporting a newborn child, but the funding is only to the mother, not to their child, because they don't have an impairment. And yet she needs help to be a mother. You can't do that. The support worker is there just for the mother, not for the child. You get that sort of stuff, like very common. Then, of course, the recipient's needs are interpreted in terms of what the service system currently offers. It's a really common one. She needs home help. Why does she need home help? Well, we are a home help service. So here's a bit of discipline here for us, is not to talk about people's needs in terms of how we meet them. Right? Because that might be, she doesn't need home. There's no such need as home help. There's no such need as a psychologist. Right? There's not even such need as a chiropractor. What I need is to walk well or to be free of pain. That's my need. Now I can think of a whole range of ways I might do that. But once I sign off to home help, it's taken out all the other possibilities. And so what is the need that home help was designed to respond to? And if we identify that, we may have some other ways that we can respond rather than just call for home help. And sometimes home help is needed as a response to the need. Of course, we've got the confusion about what people say they want, and therefore we think what they want is what they need. Now, there may be an overlap on this. I may want a Maserati, but my need is for mobility. I end up with a push bike, right? Because I need to get around. So want is a little bit different from what I need, and you can't assume that they're equivalent to each other. And sometimes I want things that actually are bad for my needs, like to to be drunk most of the time, or to be on drugs is what I want, but it's destructive to what I need. But not always. And now notice too that most needs that people have are the same needs as everyone. And I think Samantha talked about the universality of needs. What's different though is that their needs are often more intensified. So the need for communication, the need for good food. If I have dysphagia, the trouble in swallowing, then I'm going to need food provided in a really precise way in order that I get to eat. The need for eating is the same, but it's now much more intensified because I can choke and die on every meal. So you get that sense of intensity that changes it somewhat in highly specific ways. And then, of course, people can have needs that are complex and great. And you might say many needs that need to be met for home, for relationship, for safety, for decent food, for prolonged trusting relationships, free from harm, all of that. And there are some people and families where it present that everything is going wrong, and it can be quite difficult and tricky to respond to.
Closing slide graphic text with thanks to John Armstrong. Web address johnarmstrong.media. This video was made possible with the support of an information and capacity building grant through the Department of Social Services. Produced by Belonging Matters. Belonging Matters makes every effort to provide accurate and up-to-date material. However, information is subject to change and our materials for reference only. This video was produced on the land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Ngunnawal people. Logos, Belonging Matters and Talks That Matter.net.